Our speaker tonight, let me get my notes out so I can, but Joe Abodeely, did I say that right?
Close enough for a government word.
Okay. Is one of the foremost historians of Arizona military history. He is not only the CEO of the Arizona Military Museum in Phoenix, but he himself has lived a lot of that history. He's a native of Arizona, a resident of Maricopa, and a decorated Vietnam veteran. And when I say decorated, just a couple of the things that he got recognized: a Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, Air Medal, Vietnam Service Medal with Silver Star, Vietnamese Cross of Valor with Palm, as well as many others. So he's many times affectionately known as Colonel Joe.
I'm called other things too.
but we're going to keep it.
You know, can't talk about that in Reed's company.
But if you ever want to have a great book, a great perspective of Vietnam, he wrote a book called Dear Mom and Dad, Love from Vietnam. And it's an award-winning book. It's really a very good book, and it gives you a great perspective. And
I just happen to have a bunch of them in the car for sale if anybody wants them.
if anybody,
$20 American money.
But he's also the founder and CEO of the Arizona Military Museum in Phoenix. On the back table, he brought some brochures. Make sure that you bring one so that you can see where it is. And believe me, if you want to know anything about military history in Arizona, from conquistadors
to the present,
it's there.
And it's free.
And it is a free museum. So open Saturdays and Sundays.
from 1 to 4.
Okay. He also was appointed by Governor Ducey as a board of directors of the the Arizona Historical Society. So, did I leave anything out?
You know, you said more than you needed to.
Okay, with that, Joe, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for having me here today. My name is Joe Abodeely. I'm the director of the Arizona Military Museum, and I would like to introduce a couple of my board members who took the time to be here tonight. Trudy Cook is our secretary, and Robert Flores is on our board of directors. Robert, raise your hand. Robert was a Marine for 31 years. I always joke and say you couldn't get a real job, but he served his country, and we're glad to have him on the board, and he's a good friend. I'm going to talk to you tonight about the forming of the 1st Arizona Volunteer Infantry. In preparing for tonight, I could have done a PowerPoint, and eventually I'm going to put a PowerPoint together, but I didn't tonight. You're just going to hear me talk a lot, and I'll try and make it interesting, and I'll read a little bit because I don't want to miss anything. But let me tell you why I did it this way. I've been the director of the Arizona Military Museum since 1980. A couple more years, that'll be 40 years. That's longer than people in Washington, D.C. have been in the Smithsonian, stuff like that. And over the years, I've gathered stuff and information about the 1st Arizona Volunteer Infantry, who, by the way, I'll jump ahead to give you, just to speak off the cuff. During the Civil War, the Apaches were still a problem. And the territorial governor, Noble Goodwin, went back to Washington, D.C., and I always like to joke about this because he went back there to see if he could get some help from Grant and Lincoln to fight the Apaches. And I jokingly say it like this: Grant and Lincoln must have looked at him and said, "You dumb ass, we're in the middle of a civil war. We're not going to give you any troops." But they did authorize him to raise 5 infantry companies. So he went to the territorial legislature and got $10,000, which in those days, about 1864, had to be like all the money in the world. That was a lot of money in those days. A lot of money today. So he got the money, he got the authorization, and little by little, and I'll get into more detail how it really started, he raised 5 companies. One was raised, question?
How many people do a company?
Well, normally today 150 people to a company. In those days it wasn't. If they had 80 or 90, that was a big deal. So Doesn't really matter how many because they could get what they could. What he did is he recruited primarily Mexican, Pima, and Maricopa to make these 5 companies. Company A was out of Fort Whipple. Company B was out of, they call it Camp Verde, Fort Verde, or Fort Lincoln. We know it as Camp Verde now, okay? And then one out of Calabasas, which is near Tubac, and this is Washburn's March. We're going to talk about Washburn a little bit. Washburn's going north. And 2 of the companies came from a place called Maricopa Wells. So 40% of the first militia of Arizona came from this area out here. There's a lot of rich history, including and especially military history, right out here in this area. And so when I got into this, I thought it was just really exciting. So I'm going to go through this, and if I get real hoarse, do they have bottles of water here or anything like that? Well, okay, because my voice is going to get... You know, Robert, I'll tell you what, if... okay, thank you. I'll talk slow. Okay. Oh, as long as I do walk slow now, too. All right, so what I want to do is I want to go through a lot of this stuff because it's compiled from about 10 to 12 different pieces of work or documents that I put together. And I'm going to eventually synthesize it even smaller and add some pictures and stuff for the future. But some of the pictures will be something like this, something like that's the 1st Arizona Volunteer Infantry soldier right there. And then there's Maricopa Wells over there. Okay? Now that Maricopa Wells, that was taken in about the 1880s, I think, wasn't it?
Yes. 70.
70? So, a little later than what we're talking about. So, one of the first accurate accounts of an Indian and American military alliance is recounted in the Pima calendar sticks, which relate that the Pima and Maricopa joined with white soldiers in a campaign against the Apaches under White Hat in 1856 or 57. If whites were just passing through, the protection that Pima and Maricopa provided for their supply trains was sufficient. Pima and Maricopa fulfilled this need with regular punitive raids against the Apaches several times a year, keeping them away from Pima lands, but stopping short of attacking the Apaches' mountain rancherias or their village camps. As the white population increased, so did the Apache raids. When gold was discovered in the Weaver and Walker diggings near Prescott, miners flocking to the area found themselves much closer to Apache homelands than was prudent for survival. So you can still see right now that the Pima were already starting to, and Maricopa was already starting to protect the settlers. Carlton's California Volunteers, or Carlton's Column as it's actually known. Thank you, sir. No beer? Okay. Carlton's, I'll probably do better if I, okay. Carlton's California Volunteers established Camp Lowell. Those of you from Tucson heard Fort Lowell. Okay. There's a street called Fort Lowell. You go out to the end of it to the east, and there's Camp Lowell, or Fort Lowell. They used to call the post camps, post, fort. I guess maybe depending on how many people they had there at the time, or if the whim of the commander. But Carlton's California Volunteers established Camp Lowell in Tucson in 1862 after Captain Sheridan Hunter evacuated his Confederates. Remember, the Confederates got into Tucson. So Carlton's California Column was coming from the west, from California, and Hunter's people they even got to Maricopa. What's the mill? The road over there, I can't think of his name over here. But Hayden. What is it? Hayden, was it Hayden's Mill? No, not Hayden's Mill. It's a street. I'll think of it later. But anyway, make a long story short, they got all the way there. They captured a couple Union people, but eventually they saw the Carlton's California Column was just too big. Carlton had infantry, cavalry, and artillery. And Sheridan Hunter, the Confederates had occupied Tucson, but they didn't have enough. It wasn't a match. The only thing they did, they sent a patrol. You've heard of the patrol at Picacho Peak, little skirmish there. A couple of people get killed, all that other stuff, and that's the famous battle at Picacho Peak. They also found a Fort Bowie near Apache Pass and Fort Whipple near Prescott. Even though Carlton and his Confederate counterpart, John Baylor, ordered the extermination of all hostile Apache men in Arizona, the California volunteers were spread too thin to conquer the Yavapais and Apaches or protect the settlers in outlying ranches and mines. Pioneers went Indian hunting, slaughtering men, women, and children wherever they found them, and American Indians responded with brutalities of their own. So, a lot of hostilities going both ways. With the Civil War still going on and Carleton still fighting the Navajos and dealing with the Apaches, the U.S. War Department authorized the territorial governor, John Noble Goodwin, as I mentioned to you earlier, of Arizona, raised 5 companies of Arizona volunteers in 1864. Now this is interesting because I'm going to read you some of this stuff. So 5 companies, A through E is 5. But when you start reading some of this other stuff, you start hearing about companies F and G. Don't ask me what that means or why they said it. I don't know, because maybe they were dividing up the companies and they wanted to have extra. That's why you asked me how many are in a company. Maybe in those days as many as they wanted or as many as they could get. Okay, but here's the authorization of 5 companies. The Governor Goodwin organized the 1st Regiment of Infantry in Arizona in 1865. The Odom, or the Pima Warriors, were there to defend the people when the U.S. military left Arizona in 1861 to fight in the U.S. Civil War. The Odom were the only armed force to defend the peaceful settlements from the Apache raids in the Arizona Territory. On February 20th, 1864, Governor of Arizona Noble Goodwin asked for authority to raise a regiment of volunteers in Arizona for service for 3 years, or during the war. In reply, he received the following letter from the War Department, Provost Marshal General Office, Washington, D.C., April 1st, 1864. Quote, and it's the flowery language. I could have thrown all this out, but I just want you to get the flavor of all this. His Excellency, the Governor of Arizona, Fort Whipple, Arizona Territory. Sir, as requested in your letter of the 20th of February, you are hereby authorized to raise within the territory of Arizona 1 regiment of volunteer infantry to serve for 3 years or during the war. The Chief Mustering Officer for the Department of the Pacific will exercise General Superintendent over the recruitment. All supplies will be furnished under existing regulations. Copies of the necessary regulations will be furnished you by the Adjutant General of the Army, James B. Fry, Provost Marshal. General Carleton added the following endorsement. Headquarters, Department of New Mexico, respectfully returned. If the proclamation of the governor be issued, instructions will be sent from here. Arizona belongs to this department. James H. Carleton, Brigadier General Commanding, October 14, 1864. See, these are little statements I just didn't want to leave out. You just missed the flavor of what's going on at this time. And all the, I'll clean this up, all the urinating contests between the different people and the authority of who has, this is, you're here and Arizona, okay. All right, anyway. Recruitment was delayed for a year. In 1865, an effort was made beginning in June of that year to raise a regiment as required. William H. Gavin was appointed Adjutant General of the Territory, to whom all reports were made. There was much difficulty in raising men at that time. Those who were ready to enlist, mostly Mexicans, were out of employment and willing to take almost any job which would provide them with food and clothing. Many of them were leaving the territory, as also were many of the whites. This was particularly the case in the southern part of Arizona. From the message of the acting governor to the second legislature, it appears that the 4 companies were organized, one being of Pima Indians, another of Maricopa Indians, the other 2 companies being largely made up of Mexicans. John D. Walker, who afterwards became identified with many industrial interests in the territory, was captain of the Pima Indians Company. Anthony Azul, you may have heard the name, Pima Chief, was their first lieutenant. And W.A. Hancock, who was afterwards located in the Salt River Valley and became identified with the early settlement of that portion of the territory, was made second lieutenant. In a letter dated Fort Yuma, May 21st, 1865, addressed to Captain H.B. Fleming, Chief Mustering Officer of the Department of Pacific. Mustering means gathering the troops, enlisting the troops, forming the organization, okay? By the way, in our Arizona Military Museum, we have the actual muster rolls. Trudy, does this put more life into what that stuff we have there now? This gives it some meaning. This is what was going on when they're having them signed. And in those days, the calligraphy, they had to write real nice and all that stuff, and then other people, wrote for them and all that stuff. But requested a mustering officer of the territory at once. On arrival of Governor Goodwin at Maricopa Wells, anybody ever hear of Maricopa Wells? Okay. A letter dated May 31st, 1865, addressed to Mr. Robert Pastel, Prescott AT, meaning Arizona Territory. Because remember, we're only territory. Okay. authorized him to recruit a company of infantry for the 1st Regiment Arizona Volunteers in the counties of Yavapai, Mojave, and Yuma within 90 days from date. Pastel was to be a 2nd lieutenant, and the company was to be known as Company A. So Company A was those northern company. It was the northern company of those northern areas. Thomas Ewing of Pima Villages was also given authority to raise a company of Maricopa Indians to be known as Company B, and the same authority was given to J.D. Walker, also of the Pima Villages, to raise a company of Pima Indians, the company to be known as Company C. A letter with similar instructions dated back June 13, 1865, was given to James Lee of Tucson to raise a company within the county of Pima, Company D. Authority was given to Hiram S. Washburn of Patagonia Mine to recruit Company E. He was later authorized to recruit companies F and D. I only know up to Company E, but that's okay. He was authorized, maybe it just never happened. Okay. As Mr. James Lee declined to recruit Company D, Wickenburg, Arizona Territory, July 29, 1865, Mr. Cervantes was given authority to recruit Company A as Mr. Pastel declined to do so. From the message of the acting governor to the 2nd legislature, 4 companies were organized. So see here you're talking about 4, then before I was talking to you about 5, but if you go up to F and G, you're talking about 7. So, I don't know. But this is why I wanted to present it all to you, and if you're really that anal, then you go look at it and tell me about it later, okay? H.S. Washburn was captain of the 1st company, which was recruited to its full strength. Washburn. That's Washburn's march. That's portraying Washburn's march, and we'll get into that in a second. Was captain of the 1st company, which was recruited to its full strength, and Oscar Hutton was 2nd lieutenant of the 3rd company. These companies were apparently mustered in and mustered out by the Military Department of the Pacific. They were hampered at the start by the want of supplies, arms, and ammunition. Although it seems that until the latter part of the year 1865, General Mason, who had succeeded General Carleton in the command of the Department of Arizona, lent every assistance in his power. The companies were mustered as follows. Now here we go, here's a delineation. Company A was mustered at Fort Whipple, AT, meaning Arizona Territory, October 7, 1865. Company B was mustered at Maricopa Wells, AT, Arizona Territory, September 2, 1865. Company C was mustered at Maricopa Wells, AT, September 2, 1865. Company E was mustered at Calabasas, AT, November 2, 1865. Company F was mustered at Calabasas, so maybe they did get a couple companies at Calabasas. AT, November 3, 1865. Companies A, E, and F were composed entirely of natives of Arizona or Mexicans. Company B was composed entirely of Maricopa Indians, and Company C of Pima Indians. The officers of the several companies were all Americans, with the exceptions of Lieutenants Gallegos and Cervantes, who were natives of Mexico. I'm guessing, this is just a guess, but those 3 companies, E, F, and G, which were the Mexicans down south, I'm guessing as they brought them up north, if anybody dropped off, or then they made the one big company E. All right, Maricopa Wells, again, Maricopa Wells, where companies B and C were mustered into service, was to become a frequent stopping point for travelers and the military taking a southern route through Arizona. Is Pat Brock here? No, okay. Well, I took part of this from her book, okay? Through Arizona. One of the first armories for the Arizona troops was Maricopa Wells. By the middle of the 19th century, traffic on the trail was intense. In the 3 years following the discovery of gold in California, more than 60,000 people crossed the ferry at Yuma. Most all of these passing through Maricopa. By 1870, it had become what may be called Arizona's first mini mall, with a general store, saloon, staff living quarters, an office, a blacksmith shop, stables, and a hotel, all in one long U-shaped building surrounding a 2-acre square enclosure by a high adobe wall on the open end. Oh, I'm going to say it. It would have really been famous if it had a brothel, but it didn't. By the way, that is the way Yuma was founded, and that's a whole other story. I'm serious. Yuma was on Arizona side, one side, and the water kept changing, so they put Yuma on the higher banks on the California side, where you know it to be now. And then the Great Western, I forgot her name, she was a seamstress, a cook, and a procurer, and she went across the river, and she set up a bawdy house, and that's how Yuma got started. Arizona's got a lot of colorful stories about it.
Change the configuration of the Gadsden purchase?
No, that isn't what changed it. What changed it?
The river changed.
No, that isn't what changed it. What changed the configuration of the Gadsden Purchase, goes like this and up like that. Remember Santa Ana? He was involved in this. And he knew we wanted that to go straight wide, because then we got a seaport at Rocky Point, Puerto Peñasco, and Santa Ana's. You ain't gonna have it. So that's why we don't have a seaport in Arizona.
I heard the surveyors wanted to know where the Rockville was, and that's why it changed.
You be my straight man, I'll tell the jokes. That's a good point, good point. Okay, so Maricopa Wells, where companies B and C were mustered in their service, was to become a frequent stopping point for travelers and the military taking the southern route through Arizona. One of the first armories for the Arizona troops was Maricopa Wells. Okay, I already went over this. 60,000 people crossed the ferry at Yuma. Most of those passing through Maricopa. By 1870, it had become okay, I already went through that. The Indian soldiers mustered into the 1st Arizona Volunteer Infantry received a blue blouse trimmed in red for the Maricopa and blue for the Pima. What is that? That's blue. He's blue. So he's a Pima. 1 pair of blue pants, 1 pair of shoes, and 1 yard of flannel for a headdress. Most of them wore teguas, shoes of untanned hide with broad soles turned up at the toes with a hole to admit air and remove dirt. Scouts were often carried out on foot. They use this expression a lot. Scouts were often carried. When they say scouts, they mean scouting parties. Patrols is what they really mean. Vietnam, we used to call them goats.
What did you call them?
Goats. I remember when I got there during the Blitz here, they were getting 10 offense. I have to tell you this story. I asked one of my RTOs, he said, well, 2-6, that was my call. He says, we're supposed to go out on a goat tonight. I says, why do they call them goats? He says, well, you know how they sometimes will take a goat and tie it up to a stake and wait for the tiger to come so you can kill it? We're the goat. Got it. Okay. All right. They call them scouts. Okay. The Indian soldiers mustered into the 1st Arizona Volunteer Infantry. Okay, I went through. Scouts were often carried out on foot with packs containing a canteen, a blanket, and some dried beef and pinole, a food made of 1 part sugar to 2 parts roasted ground corn or wheat mixed with water. The Indians were expected to provide their own horses, excuse me, but allowances were sometimes made for feed. Although these were the intended provisions, circumstances did not always afford them. The Indians often endured the cold without benefit of warm clothes, bedding, or shoes, but the Pima and Maricopa were used to hardships and were familiar with the country. By the fall of 1865, more than 350 men had been issued into service under the command of 9 officers. The overwhelming majority was Mexican, many of them from Sonora or Odom and Maricopas from the Gila River villages, who had grown up fighting Yavapais and Apaches, as had their fathers and grandfathers. Many never received shoes or warm clothing. They lived in hovels and marched for days on beef jerky and parched cornmeal. They carried 54 caliber or 14 millimeter rifles with plenty of ammunition, in addition to bows, arrows, and war clubs. For the next year, the 1st Arizona Volunteer Infantry guarded wagon trains between Prescott and La Paz and campaigned relentlessly across central Arizona. That's what they would have looked like. He's got a club on the side there. The club is made of mesquite or ironwood. It's carved and it feels like metal. You bash a guy's brains in with that. One of the records of Indian fighting by these companies prepared by John D. Walker is as follows. Quote, General, in compliance with your circular March 30th, I have the honor to state that my company is now on detached service at this place per SOB, Special Order, number 27, headquarters, Fort McDowell. The company left this place on the 27th, accompanied by 260 volunteer Pimas and 40 enlisted men of Company B, 1st Infantry, AV, meaning Arizona Volunteers. Had a fight with the Apaches on the morning of the 31st, killing 25 Apaches, taking 16 prisoners and 8 horses. Had 3 Pimas wounded, one of whom died on the 1st. My company are armed with Mississippi rifles. worn and are at present well clothed. But during the first 6 months' service, they were not. If the territory could furnish 200 carbines and pistols for 2 companies of mounted Pimas, it would be of great service in ridding this country of Apaches. The arms could be stored here and given to the men when going on campaigns, returned here again on returning, without danger of being lost. Yours respectfully, J.D. Walker, Lieutenant, 1st Infantry, Arizona Volunteers. W.H. Garvin, Adjutant General, T.Y. Arizona, Territory, Arizona. He mentioned about the rifles. They wanted carbines. And about this time now, the carbines they were using could have been a Sharps carbine. But the 1st Arizona Infantry carried the Mississippi rifle, which was used in 1846, 1848 to the Mexican War. The carbines, like the Sharps, easier to fire. Carbine is a smaller weapon. It's not as long. And we now realize you don't need a long rifle anymore to kill somebody, okay? That's why we have the M16 or the Car-15, okay? H.S. Washburn was captain of the 1st Company, which recruited to its full strength, and Oscar Hutton was 2nd Lieutenant of the 3rd Company. These companies were apparently mustered in and mustered out by the Military Department of the Pacific. They were hampered at the start by the want of supplies, arms, and ammunition. Although it seems until the latter part of the year 1865, General Mason, who succeeded General Carleton in the command of the Department of Arizona, lent every assistance in his power. The activities of Captain H.S. Washburn's company, which was recruited in the lower part of the territory, was given in the following general report to the Adjutant General of the territory, bearing date September 20th, 1866, which gives a succinct narrative of the services and suffering of his command up to that date. This is Washburn's march. So this is his report. This is the main thing I want to give you. So am I talking too fast? Are you able to keep up with me? Okay?
We're listening fast.
Okay. Are y'all bored to tears, or is this remotely interesting? I think it's interesting because this is really the military history of Arizona. And this is how we fought off the Apaches. Adjutant General Garvin, Sir, I have the honor to acknowledge receipt of your letter of the 6th instruction, requesting me to make out a synopsis of my service in the Arizona Volunteers, showing the number of scouts, meaning the patrols, made, the number of Indians killed, prisoners taken, and the condition of my company, and in reply begged leave to say that as early as June last I commenced a minute report of such character as you have just requested. But the continual press of duties that could not be neglected have prevented a rough and hasty report is all that I am now able to prepare. Jesus, is that flowery or not? You know? Okay. On the 24th of June, 1865, I received from Governor Goodwin authority to raise a company of infantry for Indian service in this territory, to be known as Company E, together with the appointment of 2nd Lieutenant, all of the same footing as all volunteers in the service of the U.S., as was directed to take recruits to the commissary of musters at Tubac, which is near where that is, who would subsist them till the company was organized. 80 men was the minimum and 100 the maximum authorized. So that answers your question. So 80 men the minimum, 100 at that time for a company. Today it's about 150 for a company. But in those days they didn't have a weapons company. And this is actually all infantry. It's not even cavalry. So they're not going to have the farriers and all the other people and the supply and stuff to deal with horses. Just plain foot infantry.
How big is a regiment?
A regiment is usually 4 or 5 companies. It depends. They've tailored it differently. It was different then, and then it was different in World War II. It was different in Vietnam. For example, I was with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, 1st Air Cavalry Division, Custer's old unit. I was a cavalry officer, but we didn't have horses. We had helicopters. So we weren't even really cavalry. We were dragoons, mounted infantry, okay? But we maintained the old regimental designation, but we had like 150 men, but there were 4 companies, 3 of them were line companies, and 1 of them was a mortar company. So it depends. They tailor them different ways at different times. That's why I hedged with you before. Now they tell us those are the limits. 80 was the minimum, and 100 was the maximum. But remember, it said earlier they had 360 that they mustered in. You have that authorization. That doesn't mean you get all those people. Okay? With this authority, I set to work on the 15th August 1865. 80 men had been sworn in. On the 21st, 96 men had been sworn in. From the 1st, the company was in command of Lieutenant William L. Inez, California Volunteers. And this is interesting. because they're in command of the California Volunteers, okay? Not our people. You'll see why in a second. I could not be recognized as an officer until formally mustered into service. So he had to be mustered in by the California Volunteer, which did not occur until the 3rd of November, 65. While at Tubac, the men had to put up their own quarters to lay out in the heavy drenching rains, which soon endangered fevers, so that by the 20th August, 20 or 30 cases had occurred. On the 23rd, the company was ordered to Fort Mason, 15 miles high up on the Santa Cruz. If you've ever seen a map of the old forts of Arizona, it's really kind of interesting. You know, Mason, Crittenden, Calabasas, Fort Lowell, Fort Whipple, Fort Verde or Camp Verde. You know, it's just interesting how they're dotted all around the state. On the 23rd, the company was ordered Fort Mason, 50 miles up, higher up on the Santa Cruz. Sufficient transportation was furnished and the transfer made in 1 day. Here, new shelters had to be built, and a detail of 10 to 20 men was required to aid in the construction of post quarters. Meantime, sickness increased fearfully, and often to fill the details made upon me required of the sick. I had from the first asked, begged, and pleaded to be kept in the field, hunting Indians and not making adobes, that not being the service for which my company was intended. This, as the commanding officer should be done as soon as the men could be mustered in the service and clothed. So they would probably be making adobe bricks to make adobe structures. Now, in those days, you know what, when you hear about the cavalry and the horses in 1860, you know what usually the sick call was the most? If it wasn't syphilis,
Dysentery.
malaria. And even into the Spanish-American War, we had a lot of malaria problems. People died and got sick of malaria. Spanish-American War, and we didn't know what it was. There were burning blankets in the uniforms because they didn't know what caused it. Mosquitoes. So we've learned. I'm reading between the lines here, giving my editorial comments based on my experience. If you disagree with me, feel free to say so, but I think that's the best. There are a lot of people that are sick. What are they sick from?
They're also sick from dysentery.
Well, why?
Because bad water.
Could be. Could be. We don't know. Could be that. Bad water. And, well, related to the bad water is the malaria.
Absolutely.
Okay. At Tubac, I'd been promised that the clothing would arrive in 10 days. Thus, things continued till very soon. The sickly and ragged condition of Company E made them the laughing stock of their countrymen far and near. On the 29th October, a small amount of clothing was issued. And on the 2nd of November, 97 men were mustered in the service of the U.S. as Company E, 1st Infantry, as volunteers. Very soon after received a tolerable supply of clothing. On 3rd November, Lieutenant Manuel Gallegos was mustered in as 2nd Lieutenant, John Van der Meeren as 1st Lieutenant, and myself as Captain. The 1st Lieutenant, who had in no way assisted to recruit the company, left the next morning with reporting to me. It has never done one moment's service in or for the company to my knowledge. That is what I call a left-handed officer's evaluation report. He got that to the general, what a lousy officer the lieutenant was. A slight variation of duty was now made for Company E. The officers were recognized as such, and a portion of the detail or fatigue parties were changed to guard duty. Owing to the frightful amount of sickness among the whole command, the duties of the well or those who were able to be up became very onerous for more than a week. I served as officer of the day every other day, and that at a post where there were 8 companies, nearly all fully officered. Was he trying to say that none of the other officers did anything, or maybe they were all sick? You have to read between the lines. For a long time, some of the California companies could not muster more than 7 to 11 men at roll call. I have omitted to mention that while stationed at Tubac, 2 recruits were sent to the San Antonio mine to recruit more men. 3 citizens accompanied them. Just at night, they came upon 3 Apaches driving a small band of stock from Sonora towards the White Mountains. An attack was made. 1 Indian was shot down, 1 captured, the other escaped. The stock consisted of a few jackasses, cattle, and horses. With the prisoner, were taken to San Antonio mine. The prisoner, after being questioned closely, was delivered to Corporal Francisco Rodriguez and a private, both of Company E, who took them 4 or 5 miles, where laid the bones of a Mexican, killed a short time before by the Apaches. After being reminded of the barbarous warfare he and his people were waging against all around them, the captive spirit was soon sent marching on in search of one who perhaps, as very Indian, had assisted about 2 weeks before to inhumanely murder. At the same time, stealing from San Antonio mine a much larger number of stock than now captured from them, also stolen. Do you all understand that statement? They killed his ass. Got it?
I was going to ask you, when they captured Indians, you mentioned earlier, what did they do with them when they were captured? Did they kill all of them? Or did
No.
they
From this, you're asking me, I wasn't there, but from this is one they did kill. Some others, well, let me go, I'll read it to you. In October, 32 men, Company E, and 8 men, Company F, under command of Lieutenant Gallegos, were sent in pursuit of a band of Apaches who had stolen 35 head of stock from the Cerro Colorado mine. Lieutenant G, for Gallegos, and party were absent 8 days without seeing an Indian. He attributed his ill success to the timidity and cowardice of a citizen guy. This was all the field service done by the company in the lower part of the territory. All of November was occupied in labor on quarters and guard duty. On the 4th of December, see, this is why I didn't want to miss it. This really gives you an idea what the life was like, doesn't it? Is this interesting or you're bored? You want me to jump ahead or are you okay with this?
Okay.
You okay with it? Okay. On the 4th of December, pardon?
Is there a test after?
No, unless you want one. Okay. On the 4th of December, orders were received to report with my company to headquarters at Prescott. On the next morning, the march commenced with a sick list of 29 men. All had been down at least once, but only one death had as yet occurred. Transportation was furnished only for the baggage, so that most of the sick had to walk with the well. A corporal and 2 men had been sent in search of a deserter, with orders to join their company immediately after their return. 6 men had deserted on account of the order to go north. Arrived at Tucson on the 4th day. Found all the sick improving but 2 who were worse. Applied to commanding officer of that post to have them cared for. This was refused. Took them both on, and that night one of them died. Left the other one after much entreaty with the station keeper at Point of the Mountains, and he died the same week. No further accident of moment occurred till we struck the snows at Skull Valley. From there to Fort Whipple, there was much suffering and 1 or 2 slightly frostbitten. This gives you a good account of the ordeal.
Were the ones that refused, were they Mexican or Indian?
Found the sick improved, but 2 who were worse applied for commanding. Didn't say, just said 6 men. Arrived at Fort Whipple on the 29th of December, making the march in 26 days, including 1 day's detention at Tucson for rations. 2 at Maricopa Wells. You see, you hear Maricopa Wells several times throughout all this. Very important in the development of the militia and the military of Arizona, which ultimately eradicated the Apache problem.
I heard that at a certain point in Arizona's history, it was actually expected to become the capital.
It was, but Phoenix had more clout. Highway 347 was the trunk line from the Southern Pacific up north, and Phoenix Tempe had more clout.
Southern Pacific's what killed Maricopa coming through.
Yeah.
Because they got the 25-mile swath of land.
Yep.
12 had it on each side of the
Yep.
line.
Yep.
And they killed Maricopa, except for some people that were already here.
Well, you know what? Maricopa could come back. I still think Maricopa's good. I'll tell you my thoughts about the future of Maricopa. Maricopa's a neat place. I've been living out here about 10. I was born in Tucson, so I understand the history of Tucson. I've lived in Phoenix for 25, 27, 30 years, whatever it is. Been an attorney up there for a long time. And now I live between the two, okay? And I understand the state of Arizona. I'm a native Arizona, okay? Maricopa's got a rich history. Oh, I'm going to offend you all. I'm going to offend you all. You've done a lousy job of promoting it.
Yes.
Anybody going to argue that with me?
Hell no.
No?
I used to like the
Politicians in the
Maricopa.
past as well.
Say again?
A lot of crooked politicians in the past.
Not in Arizona. Not in Arizona. No. And I believe in the tooth fairy.
I was going to build a hospital down here in '07, and I had politicians asking for $50,000 kickback.
I wouldn't be surprised. Well, look, have you noticed all the homes that are built in all these open areas there? Because the politicians decided to work with the realtors and say, we're not going to charge you any of those fees. You don't have to worry about that. Just go ahead and build it. And then the economy went into the toilet, and now you got all those open spaces over there and no building. And developers made some money, And maybe some, I'm not going to accuse the politicians of making any money. Yeah, I am.
Yeah, you are.
Okay, yeah. And here we are. All right. But Maricopa's got a lot of potential to do a lot of neat things. Arrived at Fort Whipple 29 December, making the march in 26 days, including 1 day's detention at Tucson for rations, 2 at Maricopa Wells, and 1 at Date Creek, all from the same cause. This even beats mail time. For on the 17th of this month, I received a letter from Fort Mason, dated August 4th, 1866, 18 days behind Company E's marching time to Fort Whipple. He's really proud of his unit, eh? And not deducting the 4 days detention, not an unusual sample of the Arizona Mail Service on any one of the routes since 1861. At Fort Whipple, the cold was extreme. No quarters for the men whose condition was truly pitiable. They bore all patiently and manfully, and on the 4th of January, 1866, were glad to hear the orders for march to Camp Lincoln. This order occasioned no desertions. Only 2 had to be left at the hospital, who to the end of their lives will bless Dr. Kidder and the old hospital at Fort Whipple for the good care and medical attendance shown them. The march to Camp Lincoln, as you know, is Camp Bertie, was dreadfully tedious one, owing to the wagons being loaded to twice the capacity of the mules, the bad roads, bad weather, and Grief Hill. I wonder where Grief Hill is. Well, I guess there's a hill, okay. Where we were detained 3 days by rain. Did not arrive at Camp Lincoln with the last of the command till the 16th of January, which is still ahead of many instances of mail service in Arizona. Again, he's got to stick that to the mail service, okay? In Arizona. Here we remain preparing the best temporary quarters that circumstances would permit, till the attacks a few miles above Camp Lincoln, where Lieutenant Gallegos and 38 men, Company E, were ordered in pursuit of the Indians, and returned on the 31st without meeting with the Indians. On the same day, 31st, I was ordered to receive and receipt for all the public property at Camp Lincoln, both commissary and quartermaster. Commissaries the food, quartermasters everything else. And the next day by 10 o'clock, the command of the post had changed to my hands. The command consisted of Company A, Lieutenant Cervantes, 35 men, and Company E, 88 men and 1 second lieutenant. There were no shoes on hand, but a small supply of provisions. By means of buckskin and rawhide, moccasins were soon substituted for shoes. And on the 11th, Lieutenant Gallegos and 45 men, Company E, left the post with 5 days' rations to go back on their last scout, or patrol, to the Indian Trail running east and following it in search of the enemy. The second night out, Indian fires were discovered and the preparations made for an attack, which commenced just after daylight and lasted some 2 or 3 hours. The Indians, being fortified in caves, had the great advantage. The lower caves, however, were all taken, and every occupant killed or taken prisoner. So that answers your question there. So they did take some prisoners. Lieutenant Gallegos, finding that the upper caves could not be taken without some sacrifice, concluded to withdraw. 30 Indians were killed outside of the caves, and nearly as many more within. 12 prisoners were taken. There we go again. 2 of whom afterwards died. 6 men were wounded, none dangerously. A large number of buckskins and other articles of Indian use were taken. Their commissary was found to be much better supplied than ours. But we were unable to pack off more than was needed for present use, for lack of transportation. Indeed, no transportation was used on this or any other scout. The scout occupied but 4 days' time, and on its return, I had to leave immediately to get provisions for the next issue on the 20th. Fearing that I might not be successful, I left orders to issue only half rations on the 20th. This most of the men refused to accept, and were on the point of disbanding and leaving in a body. By much difficulty, they were prevailed upon to wait until a messenger could be sent to me. Fortunately, a temporary supply of provisions had arrived at Fort Whipple, so that I was able to return and quell the discomfort in camp, which came near being a very serious affair. Provisions, however, arrived on the 25th, barely in time to keep off starvation, and to bring which required the efforts of 21 men, commissioned officers and privates, from the 18th to the 25th inclusive. On the 26th, Private Roque Ramirez had permission to go hunting, and after his return at roll call went out fishing, and next morning was found dead in the river about 1 mile below the post. He was killed by Indians, and his arms, clothing, and ammunition all taken. During all the interval from the return to the last scout, preparations were being made for another scout, and on the 1st of March, Lieutenant Gallegos and 60 men were dispatched eastward with 5 days' ration, without transportation, in search of the enemy, and returned on the 6th without seeing an Indian. 2 very important items were lacking. One was a good guide, and also lances. The rifles furnished Company E having no bayonets. Application had previously been made for both, but the want of them was never so forcefully felt as on this scout. That's interesting. So we're in the 1860s, and the American military wanted to have lances.
We had lancers in the U.S. military, which is before the First World War. Last of them were Indian, just prior to the start of the Spanish American War.
Did we have lancers in the Spanish American War?
They disbanded.
What's the old saying, you know, like taking a knife to a gunfight? Okay. On the 20th, Lieutenant Cervantes and 26 men, all Company A, set out in accordance with previous orders to find, if possible, and chastise the enemy. On the next day, Lieutenant Gallegos, Company E, and 56 men followed in a different direction. On the 25th, Lieutenant Cervantes returned with 2 prisoners and reported having attacked a rancheria and killing 4 Indians. On the 27th, Lieutenant Gallegos and party returned having found a small rancheria, but being discovered had only a fruitless chase through the brush and rocks. On the 11th March, I set out from Camp Lincoln with 27 men, Company E, for Fort Whipple, for provisions and taking unfrequented roads through the mountains to the northward of the travel road. About midday, unexpectedly surprised a rancheria, killing 6 Indians and taking 1 prisoner. So we now see they do take prisoners. We've heard several times they took prisoners. Some expedition resulted in finding a much better route for wagons into, same expedition resulted in finding a much better route for wagons into and out of Rio Verde Valley. Provisions were again procured in limited supply, and a speedy return effected to Camp Lincoln, or as we know it, Fort Verde. Nearly the whole of this month was lost for the want of provisions in sufficient quantity to justify the undertaking of even a 5-day scout. Nearly an average of 30 men, Company E, were kept on detached service, transporting provisions in small lots as I could get them. 12 men had to be kept at the Clear Creek settlement, which, excepting during the months of March and April, was furnished by Company A. The month of May until the 23rd was passed in the same hand-to-mouth way of getting provisions, when Lieutenant Gallegos was again dispatched with 60 men on an 8-day scout. On the 29th, they returned having seen no Indians on the expedition, and scarcely a sign of them, although they were ordered in the direction where many smokes and fires had been seen by a previous scouting party. On the 31st, I had to leave the command again for provisions, taking with me 15 men for escort purposes. Arrived at Fort Whipple on the 1st of June. The next day, loaded up 10 pack animals with provisions, also taking 5, he spells it here, beeves, B-E-E-V-E-S. I was trying to figure out what that was. Cattle. Beeves.
Oh.
Beeves. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Is it an archaic word, or is it a present day?
Archaic.
It's archaic, okay. Beeves, okay. Oh, what the heck is beeves? Okay. Okay. Taking 5B. The whole was entrusted to Sergeant Miguel Elias, with precautionary instructions to be prepared at all times against surprise and attack. Notwithstanding this, on the 3rd, while descending Grief Hill, the Indians suddenly attacked the whole party in 3 divisions of 20 or 30 Indians in each, severely wounding the sergeant, slightly wounding 1 private at the first fire. So that supposed to mean they had rifles too. The Indians captured the 5 beeves, killed 2 of the mules on the spot, and destroyed several of the packs of provisions. The escort all escaped, taking in 8 of the mules and their packs in time to prevent starvation in camp. Before 2 hours, Lieutenant Gallegos with 30 men was on the ground, but the Indians had all escaped to the northward, packing off all the mule meat and destroying the pack saddles and provisions on the mules. He followed them until dark. Their route lay over a black, volcanic, rocky country, so that it was impossible to follow them, there being no moon. You know, in the museum, Trudy and Robert, you know, as we go upstairs on one landing, on the landing on the east side, there's a little shelf there, and there's a canvas type pack saddle. That's a pack saddle that they're talking about, as opposed to a riding saddle. So when they're talking about pack saddles, you can haul stuff with it. On the next day, I arrived with 30-day supply, and on the 15th, dispatched Lieutenant Gallegos 54 men on a scout to the northwest in hopes of finding these Indians in their homes, and by this time unsuspecting any pursuit. In this, I was disappointed, as they had not stopped at their old homes, but left 1 or 2 of their company's comrades to make smokes and other signs of their presence, and kept on with the prize of 2 head of beef. cattle to a place of greater security for them. 2 of their cattle they had lost. The other, it is not known positively what they did with it. How are we doing on time?
Very good. It's only
Do I have
6:30.
up to 6?
What?
5:30.
No.
No, it's 6:30.
6, do I have up to 7?
About
15 minutes?
Yeah, so 10, 15 minutes.
All right. Well, okay. Gallegos and 54 men were dispatched again looking for Indians. 1 warrior was killed. 1 old man was taken prisoner. The rest escaped. The prisoner was very communicative and reported his people completely demoralized, not knowing whether to flee for safety. On the 17th, I mounted 10 men and made a march of 30 miles up the river, coming upon Rancheria of 26 lodges. The occupants all fleeing into the mountains. Next day, we went to Camp Lincoln, finding my way 2 beeves on my way, the 2 beeves captured from Settlers and Elias on the 3rd of June and driving them in. They were first beeves killed for the command since the 20th of June. On the 28th July, I'm just going through this instead of giving you the whole detail. I just want you to get a flavor of what it was like to live and operate those days. August 3rd, 53 men and company refused to do any further duty by reason of expiration of term of service. And nothing short of actual force could have compelled them to continue. This I did not have. They had now been a year into service without receiving $1's pay from the government and could not be blamed. Provisions were therefore made for their discharge and payment. Hey, what the hell, they're just Mexicans and Indians. They don't have to pay them, right? On the 29th of August, the command at Camp Lincoln was reduced to an aggregate of 5 enlisted men, all of whom were more or less sick, and myself the only commissioned officer on the spot. Gallegos and Ford being absent, sick, this force I believe to be entirely inadequate to remain at, so I retired to a point in security. On the 30th, 31st, by assistance of the settlers at Clear Creek, all movable government stores were temporarily transferred 6 miles below to a place greater security until reinforcements could arrive. By the 13th September, 3 more enlisted men were discharged. 30th, Lieutenant Gallegos and 1 man from Company E and 2 citizens attacked a thieving party of Indians in the cornfields, killing 1 Indian and fighting off the rest, eventually waste, since the settlers have not been troubled by their raids. The 2 men remaining in Company E will be discharged. They're down to 2 men in a company. I'm just skimming through this. During all this time, the whole burden and responsibility of the organization, both from the government to the company and the company to the government, has fallen upon me. I've long been accustomed to hard and active labor and to positions of some responsibility, but never have I passed a year and 4 months of such unremitting toil and care as has passed. Had the actual needed supplies been furnished, there is no doubt that the record of this company would have been such as the officers could look back upon with pride. As it is, they see but little except disappointed hopes and expectations. One thing at least has been proven, that the native troops are far superior to any others for field service in this territory. And until this shall be taken as a basis of operations, no immediate good results can occur. Government may continue to spend its millions upon any other basis, and Apache raids will still continue. While 300 native troops, well officered, at an expense of less than $800 to the man per year, will in less than 2 years rid the territory of its greatest bane and obstacles in the way of progress. Interesting commentary. Such are some of the principal events in the history of Company E, which I should have been glad to have made out much more in extensor, but duties could not be deferred and prevented. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, H.S. Washburn, Captain, 1st Infantry, Arizona Volunteers. P.S. Before long, I will endeavor to send you a sketch to accompany this report. P.S. Another P.S. Among other missions is that the action between Sergeant Elias and 6 men Company E and 27 Apaches while returning from escort service to Prescott. The fight lasted 2 hours. Elias had a bullet shot through his hat, and 1 of the men was taken and retaken 3 times. 1 of the men lost his hat, and 2 of them a blanket each. The Indians had several wounded, 2, it is thought, mortally. They retired from the fight just in time, as the men had only 3 or 4 rounds of ammunition left at the close of the fight. H.S. Washburn, Captain, etc. Adjutant General Gavin reported that he would allude to the valuable service performed by the volunteers only in a general way, because to particularize in service performed by any particular company would do injustice to others. Company F, he writes here, Company F has been stationed at Skull Valley the greater portion of their terms of service and has done some been efficient in escorting scouting for Indians under the command of Lieutenant Oscar Hutton. Companies B and C have been stationed at Fort McDowell under command of Lieutenant Ewing and Captain Walker. The duty performed by the companies has been scouting for Indians and from all I can learn, they have done the country good service in killing and capturing a large number of Apaches. Companies A&E stationed at Camp Lincoln, later Fort Verde, have done valuable service despite the obstacles they have had to contend with. Since the 15th of February last, they have killed and taken prisoner about 100 of the Apaches, and for all at least 1.5 of that time, they have been compelled to remain inactive for the want of necessary food and clothing. From all the information that I can gather, it has been the same conditions with all the volunteer troops throughout the territory. Adjutant General Gavin went on to comment on the severe hardship of the volunteers. He comments on what they had to endure. Quote, taking into consideration the fact that the troops are composed of men coming from a hot climate and arriving in this portion of the territory in the middle of an unusually severe winter, with the country covered heavily with snow, barefoot, half-clad upon half-rations, it is with great wonder that the officers and privates bore their hardships as patiently and manfully as they did. But the term of the service of the volunteers has expired, and most of them have been mustered out. According to the 3rd Territorial Legislature, the volunteers inflicted, quote, greater punishment on the Apaches than all other troops in the territory, end quote. Traveling, quote, barefoot and upon half-rations, quote, they killed 150 to 173 Apaches and Yavapais while losing only 10 men in combat themselves. If their enlistments had been extended, as many territorial officials and Army officials requested, the centuries-old alliance of Hispanic, O'odham, and Maricopa frontiersmen might have conquered the Apacheria for the Anglo newcomers. After their year in service ended, the War Department disbanded the Arizona Volunteers. The official reason was bureaucratic. The Army did not have the authority to retain Native recruits, but racial and cultural prejudices undoubtedly played a role in this decision as well. You know, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Remember, after this, after the Civil War, 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th and 25th Infantry Divisions, or 24th and 25th Infantry, came out of Louisiana, Buffalo Soldiers. But you can't have ethnic groups of Indians. Okay. The volunteers were not even paid the $100 promised to them upon enlistment. According to the 3rd Annual Territorial Legislature, the volunteers inflicted, quote, greater punishment on Apaches than all other troops of territory traveling barefoot upon half-rations. They killed 150, 173 Apaches, and the Yavapais were losing only 10 men in combat themselves. Okay, I read that. After the volunteers were disbanded, the Apaches remained a problem. I'm almost done, so bear with me. A problem for settlers, ranchers, stagecoach travel, and travelers in general. For the next 15 years or so, there was continuous fighting with Apaches. Notorious Apache leaders who conducted the marauding, stealing, and killing were Cochise, Victoria, Nane, and Geronimo. You've heard these names before. Federal troops primarily engaged the Apaches, but many Arizona communities formed their own organizations to defend themselves. In 1877, the territorial legislature authorized the organization of a state militia and appropriated $10,000 for its use. Several of the Arizona's larger communities contributed to the formation of the 1st Infantry Regiment. Prescott led the way by organizing local troops into a company known initially as the Mulligan Guards, but which later became were renamed the Prescott Grays. Grays, G-R-A-Y-S. Their commander was Captain William Owen Bucky O'Neill. General Miles, who replaced General Crook, employed 5,000 troops in his hunt for governor for Geronimo's tiny band of 35 warriors and about 80 women and children for 5 months. Incredible exploits took place in the Sierra Madre, and finally on 4 September 1886, Geronimo finally surrendered at Skeleton Canyon. By the way, the only reason he surrendered because they went up and told him, says, you know, we have your family, we're going to ship them off to Oklahoma, and you want to be with them or not, otherwise you're not going to be with them. So he was extorted. Concern over the militia's domestic role led states to re-examine their need for a well-equipped and trained militia. And between 1881 and 1892, every state revised the military code to provide for an organized force. Most changed the name of their militias to the National Guard. Arizona followed suit. In a report dated July 1, 1891, Adjutant General Bucky O'Neill stated the following, quote, a military code was approved by the governor on March 19, 1891. The code provided for an organization of not to exceed 10 companies in the territory. Such companies to be organized in the not to exceed 3 battalions, and all are to be consolidated into 1 regiment. The old companies were reorganized to comply with the code, and 2 additional companies have been mustered in. An allowance of $30 per month for each company is made by the territory. Under this law, all the companies have taken new life, and the National Guard of Arizona is fast becoming a splendid body of soldiers. Emphasis added. Some staff appointments have yet to be made, but with that exception, the organization is complete. The 1st Arizona Infantry Regiment was the state's militia, but the military code in 1891 codified the National Guard of Arizona. And then after that, the National Guard was on the border. It was the first Arizona Infantry, not volunteer, but first Arizona Infantry Regiment. And then in 1916, it was called Over There, and it became the 158th Infantry, and then the famous Bushmasters, etc., etc. And each one of those is different stories. I gave you a lot of info. I could have shortened it, but you now have gotten probably more than you wanted. A lot of information about the very first Arizona Volunteer Infantry and militia in Arizona. Any questions?
I just had a thought. Bill agreed. I wonder if that's when you go up and they tell you to turn off your air conditioning so you don't overheat your car.
Could be.
That's-
I don't know. You know, and you know, Crook's Trail. Remember Crook's Trail comes from the side there, and then there's another road too. I forgot the other road that takes you all the way over to the Verde River. I forgot the name of that. It's not Crook's Road, but Crook's Trail is one. But what do you all think? Interesting?
Yeah.
We do have probably a couple of minutes for questions.
Does anybody care? Did you get enough? You got a question? Is it
Yeah.
a good question or is it a dumb question?
No, it's, well, it's,
I'll let you know. I'll let you know.
Okay.
It's the attorney coming.
Yeah.
Were the volunteers there in 65, were they able to draw on the Civil War veterans benefits?
Jesus. How would I know that?
Joe, they weren't even paid.
They weren't even paid. They weren't even paid. They're being paid in there. You know, I would guess that they probably weren't.
Over
Yeah, I
half
was
those.
thinking.
My grandfather referred to Fort McDowell as the McDowell Stockade. So,
Really?
Yeah.
So you native Arizonan?
Yeah, I'm third generation native.
And your grandpa was out here?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, you could say.
Over half those that served in the Civil War that raided pensions or funds never drew anything.
I just heard about that today, about the VA thing. What did they call them? The Grand Army of the Republic?
GAR.
GAR. They went over and they went to Washington, D.C. They pitched tents. And MacArthur, people who were there, MacArthur, Eisenhower, Patton, were all there, and they turned the 30 caliber water-cooled machine guns on them, killed a couple of them.
And my grandfather was there.
Okay, you know what I'm talking about.
My grandfather was a Major General in the Marine Corps at that time.
Was what?
Major General in the Marine Corps.
In the Marine Corps at that time.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jensen.
Thanks for having me.
And once again, please go and visit the museum. The museum is one of the great opportunities to see some interactive history. It's open Saturdays and Sundays.
Here's his water. Hey, water.
Yeah, but it was part of ours.
Hey,
Robert.
Robert. Didn't drink it.
Pleasure talking with you.
Oh, yeah.